It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Pinewood Hills. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where houses sat in neat rows, and kids rode bikes up and down the street. Everyone waved to each other, and people liked to think they knew everything about everyone. But guess what? They didn't know everything. Not even close. Because something big was about to happen, something nobody saw coming. Say hello to Jake Carter. Jake was the new guy in town. He wasn't loud or fancy. He was just a regular guy with a big, friendly smile that made you feel happy when you saw it. Jake loved painting. Not pictures or art, but things like houses and fences. He thought colors could make the world more fun. When he moved into his little house on Maple Street, he looked at the old, wobbly fence in his yard and grinned. That fence was falling apart, with peeling paint and broken boards. Most people would say, "Yuck, that's ugly." But Jake? He saw a chance to make it awesome. Jake had just unpacked his last box when he stepped outside to look at his new home. The house was small, with white walls and a red roof. It wasn't much, but it was his. The grass needed a trim, and the mailbox leaned a little to the left. But that fence? Oh, that fence was the worst part. It looked like it might fall over if the wind blew too hard. Jake rubbed his hands together and said to himself, "Time to fix you up, old buddy." He had a plan. A big, colorful plan. But here's the thing nobody knew: Jake had a secret. A secret so huge it could shake up all of Pinewood Hills. And soon, everyone would find out what it was. "Morning, Jake," a cheerful voice called out. Jake turned around and saw Mrs. Linda, his next-door neighbor. She was a sweet old lady with curly white hair and glasses that slid down her nose. She stood in her yard, holding a green garden hose. Water sprayed everywhere as she waved at him. Jake waved back and thought, "She's nice." Mrs. Linda wore a big floppy hat to keep the sun off her face, and she smiled like she was happy to see him. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," she shouted. "You let me know if you need anything, okay?" "Thanks, Mrs. Linda." Jake yelled back. He liked her already. She seemed like the kind of person who'd bake cookies and share them with everyone. Jake figured Pinewood Hills might be a pretty cool place to live. But not everyone was as friendly as Mrs. Linda. Oh no. There was someone else in this neighborhood, someone who didn't like new people, or fun ideas, or anything that wasn't her way. And that someone was about to make Jake's life a whole lot trickier. Let me introduce you to Karen Wilson. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the boss of the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. The HOA was a group of people who made rules for the neighborhood, like what color your house could be or how tall your grass could grow. Karen loved those rules. She loved them so much she carried a clipboard everywhere she went, writing down anything she didn't like. She had sharp eyes and a loud voice, and she walked around like she owned every house on the street. Her hair was always perfect, pulled back tight, and she wore fancy clothes that made her look important. To Karen, Pinewood Hills was her kingdom, and she was the queen. Most people in the neighborhood were a little scared of Karen. If your trash can stayed out too long, she'd knock on your door and yell. If your dog barked once, she'd write you a note saying, "Control your animal." Karen liked everything to be perfect, her kind of perfect. And when Jake moved in, well, Karen didn't like that one bit. A new guy meant new problems. She watched him from her window that first day, her arms crossed, muttering to herself, "Who does he think he is, moving in here like that?" Jake didn't know it yet, but he was about to become Karen's next big target. See, Jake wasn't the kind of guy who followed every little rule. He liked to do things his way. And that fence? That rickety, beat-up fence? Jake had a wild idea for it. He didn't want it to be boring white or plain brown like all the other fences in Pinewood Hills. Nope. Jake wanted something different. Something bright. Something that would make people smile when they walked by. But Karen? She wasn't going to like that. Not one bit. That Saturday morning, Jake woke up early. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and he felt good. He put on an old t-shirt and some jeans with holes in them. Then he grabbed a big cup of water and headed outside. He stood in front of his fence, hands on his hips, and looked at it for a long time. The wood was gray and splintery. Some pieces were missing, and others hung loose like wobbly teeth. "You're a mess," Jake said to the fence, laughing a little. But I'm gonna make you look amazing. He walked to his garage and pulled out a can of paint. It wasn't just any paint. It was yellow, bright, happy, sunshine yellow. Jake popped the lid off and dipped a brush into it. The smell of paint filled the air, and he smiled even bigger. He loved that smell. It meant something new was coming. He carried the can and the brush to the fence and started painting. One stroke, then another. The yellow covered the old gray wood like magic. Jake hummed a little song as he worked, thinking, this is gonna be great. Across the street, Mrs. Linda peeked out her window. She saw Jake painting and clapped her hands. Oh, that's pretty, she said to herself. She liked the yellow. It reminded her of flowers and summer days. She thought Jake was a nice addition to the neighborhood. But not everyone felt that way. Oh no. Someone else was watching Jake, too. And that someone was Karen. Karen stood on her front porch, her clipboard in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She wore a fancy blue dress and big sunglasses, even though it wasn't that sunny. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at Jake's fence. Yellow paint? Yellow paint. She couldn't believe it. Her mouth dropped open, and she almost spilled her coffee. What is he doing? She whispered to herself. That's not allowed. The rules say fences have to be white or brown. White. Or brown. Karen marched down her steps and across the street, her high heels clicking on the pavement. She stopped right in front of Jake's yard and put her hands on her hips. Jake didn't see her at first. He was too busy painting, dipping his brush in the can and swiping it across the wood. The fence was starting to look alive, like it was waking up after a long nap. Jake stepped back to admire it, wiping sweat off his forehead with his sleeve. Looking good, he said to himself. That's when Karen cleared her throat. Loudly. Ahem, she said, like she was about to give a big speech. Jake turned around, paintbrush in hand, and saw her standing there. She looked mad, really mad. Her face was turning pink, and her clipboard shook a little in her hand. What do you think you're doing? She asked, her voice sharp like a teacher scolding a kid. Jake blinked. Painting my fence, he said, holding up the brush. A little yellow paint dripped onto the grass. He smiled at her, thinking maybe she'd like the color once she got used to it. But Karen didn't smile back. Oh no. She looked like she'd just seen a monster. Painting it yellow, she snapped. Do you even know the rules? This is Pinewood Hills. We have standards here. Fences are supposed to be white or brown, nothing else. You can't just move in and ruin everything. Her voice got louder with every word, and a few neighbors poked their heads out their doors to see what was going on. Jake scratched his head. It's just a fence, ma'am, he said. I thought yellow would be fun. Brighten things up a little. He shrugged, still smiling. He wasn't trying to make her mad. He just liked yellow. But to Karen, that fence wasn't just a fence. It was a problem. A big, yellow problem. Fun. Karen shouted. This isn't about fun. This is about rules. You're breaking them, and I won't stand for it. She pointed at the fence like it had done something terrible. You're new here, so maybe you don't understand. But I'm in charge of the HOA, and I say that fence has to go back to white or brown. Right now. Jake looked at her, then at his fence. He didn't say anything for a second. He just kept smiling, calm as could be. Well, he said finally, it's my fence. I kinda like it this way. Then he turned back to his painting, dipping his brush in the can again. Swipe, swipe, swipe. More yellow spread across the wood. Karen's face turned from pink to red. She couldn't believe it. This new guy wasn't scared of her. He wasn't even listening. She huffed and puffed, like a dragon about to breathe fire. You'll regret this, she yelled. I'm going to tell the HOA. I'll make sure you fix that ugly thing. You just wait. Then she spun around and stomped back to her house, her heels clicking even louder than before. Jake watched her go, still smiling. He didn't seem worried at all. And why should he be? He had a secret Karen didn't know about. A secret that was going to turn everything upside down. See, Jake wasn't just some guy who liked to paint. He was something else. Something big. And Pinewood Hills? This quiet little neighborhood was about to find out just how big. Mrs. Linda watched the whole thing from her yard. She shook her head and muttered, "Oh, Karen, you're in for a surprise." She didn't know Jake's secret not yet, but she could tell he wasn't like the others. There was something special about him. Something that made her smile as she watered her flowers. Jake kept painting, humming his little song. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the yellow fence glowed brighter with every stroke. He didn't care about Karen's rules or her clipboard or her loud voice. He had a plan, and this fence was just the start. What was his secret? Why wasn't he scared of Karen? And what was going to happen next? Well, you'll have to stick around to find out. Because this story? It's just getting started. It all started on that sunny Saturday when Jake decided to paint his fence. He didn't want a boring fence like everyone else in Pinewood Hills. Nope. Jake wanted something fun, something happy. So he picked a color yellow. Not a dark, dull yellow, but a bright, shiny yellow, like the sun or a big, juicy lemon. It wasn't wild or crazy. It was just a little splash of fun to make his yard look nice. Jake thought it would make people smile when they walked by. He thought it would make his new home feel like his. But not everyone liked fun. Especially not Karen Wilson. To Karen, that yellow fence wasn't fun at all. To her, it was a crime scene. A big, messy, awful crime scene right in the middle of her perfect neighborhood. Karen was the boss of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. She loved rules. She loved them more than anything. And one of her rules said fences in Pinewood Hills had to be white or brown. That's it? No other colors allowed. White or brown, those were the only choices. So when Karen saw Jake's yellow fence, she didn't just get mad. She got super mad. Karen was in her house that morning, sipping her coffee and looking out her big window. She liked to watch the street to make sure everyone was following her rules. She had her clipboard ready, just in case she needed to write something down. Then she saw Jake, standing in his yard, painting his fence yellow. Her eyes got wide. Her mouth fell open. She dropped her coffee cup right on the floor, and it splashed all over her fancy rug. "Yellow," she said to herself, her voice loud and squeaky. "Yellow. No, no, no. This is an outrage." Karen didn't waste a second. She grabbed her clipboard, threw open her front door, and stormed across the street. Her face was turning red like a big, ripe tomato. Her high heels clicked fast on the pavement, and her clipboard bounced in her hand. She was mad, and she wanted Jake to know it. She stopped right in front of his yard, where he was painting, and shouted, "Yellow. This is an outrage. Our rules say fences must be white or brown. Don't you dare ruin our perfect neighborhood." Jake was dipping his brush in the paint can when he heard her. He had yellow paint on his hands and a little bit on his old t-shirt. He turned around slow and looked at Karen. She was standing there, pointing at him, her face all scrunched up like she'd just eaten something sour. Jake didn't know what to say at first. He scratched his head with his free hand and said, It's just paint, ma'am. Makes me smile." That was the truth. Jake liked the yellow because it made him happy. It was bright and cheerful, like a sunny day. He didn't think it was a big deal. It was just a fence, not a rocket ship or a giant monster. But Karen didn't see it that way. Oh no. To her, that yellow fence was the worst thing ever. She didn't smile back at Jake. Not even a little. Her eyes got small and mean, and she pointed her bony finger right at him. "Makes you smile," she hissed. "This isn't about smiling. This is about rules. You'll regret this, newbie. I'm calling the HOA board and the police if I have to." Her voice was loud enough that a few neighbors peeked out their windows. Mrs. Linda, the nice old lady next door, was watering her flowers. She heard Karen yelling and shook her head. "Oh dear," she muttered. But Jake? He didn't yell back. He didn't get mad. He just shrugged his shoulders, like it was no big thing. "Okay," he said, real calm. Then he turned back to his fence and kept painting. Swipe, swipe, swipe. The yellow got brighter with every stroke. He even started humming a little tune, a happy song he liked. That calm attitude. It drove Karen nuts. She wasn't used to people ignoring her. Usually, when she yelled, people said, "Sorry, Karen, and did what she wanted. But Jake? He didn't care. He just kept painting, like she wasn't even there. Karen's face got redder. Her hands shook. She stomped her foot on the grass and said, "You think you can just do whatever you want? This is my neighborhood. I make the rules here." But Jake didn't stop. He dipped his brush in the can and kept going. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Humming his tune. Karen couldn't take it. She turned around and marched back to her house, muttering to herself. "I'll show him," she said. "I'll call the HOA. I'll call the police. That yellow fence is coming down." She slammed her door so hard the windows rattled. Inside, she grabbed her phone and started dialing numbers. She called Mr. Thompson, the HOA vice president. "We have a problem," she shouted. "The new guy painted his fence yellow. Yellow. We can't let this happen." Mr. Thompson just sighed and said, "Okay, Karen, we'll talk about it." But she wasn't done. She called everyone she could think of, telling them about the awful yellow fence. Meanwhile, Jake kept painting. He didn't know Karen was calling people. He didn't hear her yelling into her phone. He was too busy making his fence look nice. The sun was high in the sky now, and the yellow paint glowed like gold. Jake stepped back and looked at it. "Pretty cool," he said to himself. He wiped some sweat off his forehead and smiled. He liked his fence. It was his, and it made him happy. That's all that mattered to him. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't just painting. He was watching, too. Watching Karen. See, Jake had sharp eyes. He noticed things other people didn't. And something about Karen seemed off. Not just her yelling or her clipboard. Something else. Like her fancy car. It was a big, shiny black car that looked way too expensive for Pinewood Hills. Jake saw it parked in her driveway every day, all clean and perfect. And sometimes, late at night, he'd hear it pull up. He'd peek out his window and see strange people get out, people who didn't look like neighbors. They carried big bags and moved fast, like they didn't want anyone to see them. Jake didn't say anything about it. Not yet. He just watched. He saw Karen come out to meet those people, whispering and looking around. It was weird. Why was she meeting strangers in the dark? What was in those bags? Jake didn't know, but he was starting to wonder. He kept it in his head, like a little puzzle he was putting together. Karen thought he was just some new guy with a paintbrush. She didn't know he was paying attention. She didn't know he was smarter than he looked. Back at her house, Karen was still mad. She sat at her kitchen table, writing on her clipboard. She made a list of all the rules Jake was breaking. "Yellow fence against Rule 12, she wrote. "Not listening to me against Rule 1. She didn't really have a Rule 1 like that, but she wrote it anyway. She was so mad she couldn't think straight. "He's ruining everything," she said to herself. "Pinewood Hills is perfect because of me. I keep it nice. I keep it safe. And now this new guy thinks he can change it? No way." Karen stood up and looked out her window again. Jake was still painting. The fence was almost all yellow now, and it looked so bright it hurt her eyes. She hated it. She hated him. "I'll fix this," she said. "I'll make him sorry he ever moved here." She grabbed her phone again and called the police. "Hello, yes, this is Karen Wilson from Pinewood Hills," she said. "There's a man breaking the rules. He painted his fence yellow, and it's awful. You need to come stop him." The person on the phone sounded tired. Ma'am, painting a fence isn't really a crime," they said. But Karen didn't listen. "It's a safety problem," she yelled. "It's too bright. People will crash their cars looking at it. Come right now." The person sighed and said, "We'll see what we can do." Karen hung up and smiled. She thought she'd won. She thought the police would come and make Jake stop. But Jake? He didn't care. He heard Karen yelling from her house, but he just kept painting. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Humming his tune. He wasn't scared of her. He wasn't scared of the HOA or the police. Why? Because Jake had a secret. A big secret. And that secret made him different. Karen thought she was in charge, but she didn't know what was coming. She didn't know Jake was watching her fancy car and her late-night visitors. She didn't know he was ready for whatever she tried. Mrs. Linda saw it all from her yard. She was still watering her flowers, her hose making little rainbows in the air. She looked at Jake's yellow fence and smiled. "I like it," she said to herself. Then she looked at Karen's house and shook her head. "That Karen," she muttered. "Always making trouble." Mrs. Linda didn't know Jake's secret either, but she could tell he wasn't afraid. She liked that about him. The day went on, and the tension grew. Karen kept plotting. She wrote more notes on her clipboard. She called more people. She even started writing a letter to the mayor about the yellow fence. "This is war," she said to herself. She was ready to fight Jake with everything she had. She wanted that fence gone. She wanted him gone. She wanted her perfect neighborhood back. But Jake? He just painted. He finished one side of the fence and moved to the other. The yellow spread like sunshine, covering every old, gray board. He didn't argue with Karen. He didn't yell back. He stayed calm, like nothing could bother him. And all the while, he kept watching. Watching her car. Watching her house. Watching those strange visitors who came at night. Something was off, and Jake was starting to figure it out. Care days went by after Jake painted his fence yellow, and things in Pinewood Hills got crazy. Karen Wilson, the bossy HOA lady, didn't give up. Not even a little. She turned into a one-woman war machine, ready to fight Jake and his bright, happy fence with everything she had. She was mad, super mad, and she wanted everyone to know it. Karen wasn't going to let some new guy ruin her perfect neighborhood. No way. The first thing Karen did was leave notes on Jake's door. Not nice notes, oh no. Nasty ones. She wrote them with a big black pen on little pieces of paper. "Change that fence or else," one note said. "Yellow is not allowed," said another. She stuck them on his door with tape, right where Jake would see them when he came home. Every morning, Jake would open his door, find a note, and just smile. He'd pull it off, read it, and toss it in the trash. Then he'd go outside and look at his yellow fence. "Still looks good," he'd say to himself, nodding. But Karen didn't stop with notes. She got sneakier. One day, Jake was in his yard, pulling weeds from the grass. He was humming his little tune, happy as can be, when he heard a click-click sound. He looked up and saw Karen standing across the street. She had her phone out, snapping pictures of his fence. Her lips moved as she muttered to herself, "Evidence. This is evidence. He can't get away with this." She took picture after picture, zooming in on the yellow paint like it was a big crime. Jake saw her and waved. "Hey, Karen," he called, grinning. "You like my fence that much?" Karen's face turned pink. She didn't wave back. She just kept snapping pictures, muttering louder. "This is going in my report," she said. "The HOA will see this. They'll make you fix it." Then she turned and marched back to her house, her high heels clicking fast on the pavement. Jake watched her go and scratched his head. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He just shrugged and went back to pulling weeds. But Karen? She was only getting started. She was like a storm cloud getting bigger and darker every day. And one afternoon, she took things even further. It was a warm day, and Jake was outside again. This time, he was fixing a loose board on his fence. He had a hammer in one hand and a nail in the other, tapping it into the wood. The yellow paint glowed in the sunlight, and Jake smiled at it. He liked how it looked. But then he heard her voice loud and sharp. "You. New guy." Karen yelled. She was back, standing right in his yard this time. Her arms were crossed, and her face was red again. Jake looked up. "Hi, Karen," he said, calm as ever. "What's up?" Karen pointed at the fence. "That hideous yellow," she shouted. "It's a public safety hazard. It's too bright. People can't even look at it without going blind. I'm dialing 911 right now." She pulled her phone out of her pocket and held it up like a weapon. Her fingers started pressing buttons, and she smirked at Jake. "You're in big trouble now," she said. "The police will come, and they'll make you stop." Jake didn't even blink. He just grinned a big, easy grin and said, "Go ahead, call 'em." Then he went back to hammering his nail. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He acted like Karen was just a noisy bird chirping in a tree. That grin? That calm voice? It made Karen's smirk disappear. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake would beg her to stop. But he didn't. And that made her even madder. Karen pressed the call button and put the phone to her ear. "Hello, police," she said, her voice loud and bossy. "This is Karen Wilson from Pinewood Hills. There's a man here breaking all the rules. He painted his fence yellow, and it's dangerous. You need to come right now." She nodded as she talked, like she was sure the police would rush over. Jake heard her, but he just kept hammering. Tap, tap, tap. Humming his tune. The person on the phone said something, and Karen's face twisted. "What do you mean it's not a crime?" she yelled. "It's a safety problem. Do your job." She hung up and glared at Jake. "They're useless," she muttered. "But I'm not done with you." She stomped off again, leaving Jake alone with his fence. He watched her go, still grinning. Karen thought she had all the power, but she didn't notice something important. Jake wasn't just calm. He was confident. Quietly confident. And there was a reason for that. See, Jake wasn't just sitting around waiting for Karen to yell at him. He was busy. Not just with his fence, but with other things. He'd been talking to people in the neighborhood. Little chats here and there. Like with the mailman, Mr. Pete. Mr. Pete was a short guy with a gray hat who came by every day. One morning, Jake waved him over. "Hey, Pete," Jake said. "How's it going?" Mr. Pete smiled. "Good, Jake. Nice fence, by the way." Jake laughed. "Thanks. Hey, you ever notice anything weird around here?" Mr. Pete thought for a second. "Well," he said, "Karen's got that fancy car. And sometimes I see people at her house late at night. Not sure what's up with that." Jake nodded. "Huh. Interesting." He didn't say much more, but he tucked that little hint away in his brain. Then there was the gardener, Sam. Sam was a tall guy who mowed lawns in Pinewood Hills. Jake saw him cutting Mrs. Linda's grass one day and walked over. "Hey, Sam," Jake said. "You've been around here a while, right?" Sam wiped sweat off his face and nodded. "Yup. 10 years. Jake grinned. "Ever see anything funny with Karen?" Sam chuckled. "Funny? Well, she's always yelling. But yeah, her car's weird. And those guys who show up at night? Shady stuff." Jake said, "Thanks, Sam," and walked away. Another little hint for his puzzle. Even old Mrs. Linda had something to say. Jake stopped by her yard one afternoon while she watered her flowers. "Hi, Mrs. Linda," he said. "Your roses look great." She smiled big. "Thank you, dear. I like your fence, too. Don't let Karen scare you." Jake laughed. "I won't." "Hey, what's with her car? It's pretty fancy." Mrs. Linda tilted her head. "Oh, that thing? She loves it. But I've seen strange men with bags over there at night. Makes me wonder." Jake nodded. "Good to know," he said, and went back to his house. Little hints were piling up. The mailman saw stuff. The gardener saw stuff. Mrs. Linda saw stuff. And Jake? He was putting it all together, like pieces in a game. Karen didn't know he was talking to people. She didn't know he was listening. She thought he was just some guy with a yellow fence. But Jake was more than that. He was watching her, and he was starting to figure something out. Then came the big moment. Late one night, Jake couldn't sleep. The moon was bright outside, and the street was quiet. He got up to get a glass of water and looked out his window. That's when he saw Karen's shiny black car pulling into her driveway. It was super late, way past bedtime for most people. The car stopped, and two guys hopped out. They looked shady. Not like neighbors or friends. They wore dark clothes, and their faces were hard to see. And they were carrying big black bags that looked heavy. Jake's eyes got wide. "What's she up to?" he whispered to himself. He didn't know what was in those bags, but it didn't look good. Karen stepped out of her house, looking around like she was scared someone might see. She waved the guys inside fast, and they all disappeared through her door. Jake stood there, watching. Something was wrong. Really wrong. He ran to his table, grabbed his phone, and turned it on. He opened the camera and started recording. The car was still there, shiny under the moonlight. He zoomed in, catching every little move. The guys came back out after a few minutes. They didn't have the bags anymore. They got in the car and drove off, fast. Karen stayed inside, and her lights turned off. Jake stopped recording and sat down. His heart was beating quick. This is big, he said to himself. Something big is coming. He didn't know what it was yet, but he wasn't going to miss it. He saved the video on his phone and put it away. Then he smiled. A little smile. Because he had a secret, and he was ready to use it. Karen kept fighting about the fence. She kept yelling and leaving notes. But Jake? He kept watching. He talked to more people. He saw more strange things. Every day, the hints got bigger. Every day, he got closer to the truth. Karen thought she was winning. She thought Jake was just a silly guy with a silly fence. But she was wrong. Something big was building, and Jake was right in the middle of it. And didn't know it yet, but she'd picked a fight with the wrong guy. The yellow fence was just the beginning. The real trouble? It was coming for her. And Jake? He was ready. The next morning, the sun came up over Pinewood Hills like nothing weird had happened. Birds chirped, and kids rode their bikes down the street. Jake woke up early, still thinking about what he saw last night: Karen's shiny car, those shady guys, and the big black bags. He rubbed his eyes and got out of bed. That was strange, he said to himself. He grabbed his phone from the table and watched the video again. The car pulled up, the guys got out, and Karen waved them inside. It was all there, clear as day. Jake nodded. I've got something here, he said. Something big. He put the phone in his pocket and went outside. His yellow fence was still there, bright and happy in the morning light. Jake smiled at it. He liked how it looked, even if Karen hated it. But today wasn't about painting. Today was about watching. Jake wanted to know more about Karen and those late-night visitors. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he had a feeling it wasn't good. So he decided to keep his eyes open and his ears ready. Karen didn't waste any time either. She was up early, too, still mad about the fence. She stood in her kitchen, writing another note. This yellow fence is a disgrace, she scribbled. Fix it now or else. She taped it to Jake's door before he even came outside. Then she grabbed her clipboard and went to her porch. She sat in a big chair, watching Jake's house like a hawk. She wanted to catch him doing something, anything she could use against him. He thinks he's so smart, she muttered. But I'll win. I always win. Jake saw the note when he stepped out. He pulled it off the door, read it, and laughed a little. Same old Karen, he said. He crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash can by his steps. Then he looked across the street. There she was, Karen, sitting on her porch, staring at him. Her clipboard was on her lap, and her eyes were small and mean. Jake waved at her. Morning, Karen, he called, grinning big. Karen didn't wave back. She just glared harder and wrote something down. Jake shrugged and walked to his yard. He started checking his fence, making sure the paint was dry. It looked good, really good. The yellow was smooth and bright, and not a single spot was peeling. Jake was proud of it. But as he walked along the fence, he kept one eye on Karen. She didn't know he was watching her, too. She didn't know he'd seen those guys last night. And she didn't know he was talking to people in the neighborhood, picking up little clues. Later that morning, the mailman, Mr. Pete, came by again. He had a bag full of letters and a big smile. Hey, Jake, he said, stopping at Jake's mailbox. Got some stuff for you today. Jake walked over. Thanks, Pete, he said, taking the mail. Hey, you said something about Karen's car yesterday. You see those guys again? Mr. Pete nodded. Yup, last night. Saw that car pull up real late. 2 guys got out with bags. Look sneaky to me. Jake raised his eyebrows. Sneaky, huh? Did they say anything? Mr. Pete shook his head. Nope. Just went inside fast. Karen met M at the door. Jake thought about that. "Thanks, Pete," he said. "You're the best." Mr. Pete grinned. "Anytime, Jake. Keep that fence yellow, it's cool." Then he walked off to the next house, whistling a tune. Jake watched him go, his brain working. Sneaky guys with bags. Late at night. Karen meeting them. It was starting to add up, but he still didn't know the whole story. He needed more hints. That afternoon, Jake saw Sam, the gardener, mowing a lawn down the street. He decided to say hi. Sam was pushing his mower, sweat dripping down his face. "Hey, Sam," Jake called, walking over. Sam turned off the mower and wiped his forehead. "Hey, Jake," he said. "Hot day, huh?" Jake nodded. "Yup." "Hey, you ever see those guys at Karen's house again? The ones with the bags?" Sam frowned. "Yeah, last night. Saw 'em when I was driving home. That fancy car pulled up, and they ran inside. Looked like they didn't want anyone to see." Jake leaned closer. "What do you think they're doing?" he asked. Sam shrugged. "No idea. But it's weird. Karen's always so loud about rules, but she's got secrets, too." Jake smiled. "Secrets, huh? Good to know." Sam laughed. "Yup. Watch out for her, Jake. She's tricky." Jake waved as Sam started the mower again. "Thanks, Sam," he said, walking back to his house. Another piece for his puzzle. Then there was Mrs. Linda. She was outside again, watering her flowers with her green hose. Jake walked over to her fence. "Hi, Mrs. Linda," he said. "Your yard looks awesome." She turned and smiled big. "Oh, thank you, dear. I try. How's your fence holding up?" Jake grinned. "Pretty good. Karen's still mad, though." Mrs. Linda chuckled. "She's always mad. Don't worry about her." Jake nodded. "Hey, you said you saw guys at her house at night. Did it happen again?" Mrs. Linda's eyes got big. "Oh yes, last night. I couldn't sleep, so I looked out my window. That shiny car came, and two men got out. They had big bags, black ones. Karen let 'em in quick, like she was hiding something." Jake tilted his head. "Hiding something? Like what?" Mrs. Linda shrugged. "Who knows? But it's not normal, dear. Not normal at all." Jake thanked her and went back to his yard. He sat on his steps and thought about it all. The mailman saw the guys. The gardener saw the guys. Mrs. Linda saw the guys. And Jake saw them, too, with his own eyes. Big black bags. A fancy car. Late at night. Karen acting sneaky. It was like a mystery book, and Jake was the detective. He didn't tell anyone his secret yet, but he was getting closer to figuring out Karen's. That evening, Karen came back. She marched across the street with her clipboard, her face all scrunched up. Jake was sitting on his porch, drinking a glass of water. "You," she yelled, pointing at him. "That fence is still yellow. I told you to change it." Jake looked at her and smiled. "Yup, still yellow," he said. "I like it." Karen stomped her foot. "You're breaking the rules. I've got pictures. I've got notes. I'm going to win this." Jake sipped his water. "Okay, Karen," he said, calm as ever. "Do what you gotta do." Karen huffed. "Oh, I will. I'm calling the police again tomorrow. And the HOA. You'll be sorry." She turned and stomped back to her house, muttering loud enough for Jake to hear. "Stupid new guy. Stupid fence. I'll show him." Jake watched her go, still smiling. She didn't scare him. Not one bit. Because he knew something she didn't. He had his video. He had his hints. And he had his secret. Karen thought she was the boss, but Jake was ready for her. He finished his water and went inside. The night was quiet again, but he kept his phone close. Just in case. The next day, things got even weirder. Karen stuck 3 notes on Jake's door this time. "Fix it," one said. "Yellow is ugly," said another. "You're in trouble," said the third. Jake laughed and threw them away. Then he went outside to check his mail. Mr. Pete was there again. More notes, huh? Mr. Pete said, grinning. Jake nodded. Yup. She's mad. Mr. Pete handed him a letter. Saw that car again last night, he said. Same guys. Same bags. Jake's ears perked up. Same time, he asked. Mr. Pete nodded. Yup, real late. Sneaky as ever. Jake thanked him and went back inside. He was starting to see a pattern. Every night, that car came. Every night, those guys showed up. And every night, Karen was part of it. What was she hiding? Jake didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. That afternoon, he saw Sam again. Hey, Sam, Jake said. Karen's car again last night. Sam nodded. Yup. Saw it when I was locking up my truck. Those guys are creepy. Jake smiled. Creepy, huh? Thanks, Sam. Then he checked with Mrs. Linda. Oh yes, dear, she said. Last night again. Same car, same men, same bags. Something's funny over there. Jake thanked her, too. The hints were piling up fast now. That night, Jake waited. He sat by his window with his phone, watching Karen's house. Sure enough, the car came again. The same shiny black car. The same two guys got out, carrying big black bags. Karen opened her door, looked around, and waved them in. Jake recorded it all. Zooming in, watching close. They stayed inside for a few minutes, then left without the bags. Jake saved the video and smiled. Gotcha, he whispered. Karen kept fighting about the fence, but Jake kept watching her. Every note, every yell, every picture she took, it didn't bother him. He had something bigger. Something that was going to change everything. The pieces were coming together, and Jake was ready for the next step. The next morning started like any other in Pinewood Hills. The sun was up, shining bright in the blue sky. Birds sang in the trees, and a cool breeze blew through the quiet streets. Jake woke up early, feeling good. He'd been watching Karen for days, recording her sneaky late-night visitors with his phone. He knew something big was coming, but he didn't know it would happen so soon. He got out of bed, put on his old jeans and a t-shirt, and went outside to check his yellow fence. It still looked awesome, bright and happy, just the way he liked it. Across the street, Karen was awake, too. She'd been up for hours, planning her next move. She was tired of Jake and his yellow fence. She was tired of him ignoring her notes and her yells. Today, she was going to win. She'd promised to call the police, and that's exactly what she did. She stood in her kitchen, holding her phone, her face all tight and mad. Hello, police, she said, her voice loud and bossy. This is Karen Wilson from Pinewood Hills. That new guy's fence is still yellow. It's a safety hazard. You need to come right now and make him stop. She nodded as she talked, sure the police would listen this time. The person on the phone sighed. Okay, ma'am, they said. We'll send someone over. Karen hung up and smiled a mean, sneaky smile. Got him now, she said to herself. She grabbed her clipboard, put on her fancy shoes, and marched outside. She wanted to be there when the police showed up. She wanted to see Jake's face when they told him to change his fence. She wanted to win. Jake was in his yard, picking up a few sticks that had fallen from the tree. He heard a sound loud and whiny, like a siren. He looked up and saw it, a police car rolling down the street, its red and blue lights flashing. The noise got louder as it came closer, and Jake stood up straight. Huh, he said to himself. She really did it? He wasn't scared, though. Not one bit. He just watched, calm as ever, his hands in his pockets. The police car stopped right in front of Jake's house. Two officers stepped out. They were tall, wearing dark blue uniforms with shiny badges. One had a piece of paper in his hand, and the other looked around, checking the street. Karen was already there, waiting in Jake's yard. She'd run across the street as soon as she heard the sirens. She stood with her arms crossed, her clipboard tucked under one elbow. Her face had a big smirk on it, like a cat who'd just caught a mouse. She looked at Jake and crowed, "See? I told you I'd get you." The police are here now. You're in big trouble. Jake didn't say anything at first. He just grinned a small, easy grin and watched her. Karen pointed at the fence. There it is, officers, she said, her voice loud and proud. That ugly yellow fence. It's against the rules. It's a danger to everyone. Make him paint it white or brown right now. She bounced a little on her feet, so sure she'd won. She thought the cops would nod and tell Jake to get his paintbrush. She thought they'd back her up, just like she wanted. But then, something weird happened. The cops didn't even look at Jake's fence. Not once. They didn't walk over to it or touch it or say anything about it. Instead, they turned and started walking straight toward Karen. Their faces were serious, not smiley or friendly. The officer with the paper held it up, and the other one put his hand on his belt. Karen's smirk vanished. Her mouth opened a little, and her eyes got big. Wait, what's going on, she stammered, her voice shaky now. She took a step back, her clipboard slipping a little in her hands. The officer with the paper stopped right in front of her. He looked at her with hard eyes and said, Karen Wilson, you're under arrest for hiding stolen goods. We've been watching you for weeks. His voice was loud and clear, so everyone could hear. The other officer stepped closer, pulling out a pair of shiny handcuffs. Karen's face went white like all the color ran away. Arrest, she squeaked. Me? No, no, no. You've got it wrong. It's him. She pointed at Jake, her finger shaking. He's the problem. His fence. Look at it. But the cops didn't look at Jake or his fence. They kept their eyes on Karen. The officer with the paper shook his head. This isn't about a fence, ma'am, he said. It's about you. We know what you've been doing. Karen's mouth moved, but no words came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. What I've been doing, she whispered. I don't know what you mean. That's when Jake stepped forward. He'd been standing quiet, watching it all. Now he pulled his phone out of his pocket and held it up. Oh, and check this video I took last night, he said, his voice calm but strong. Those guys unloading bags at her place? Might help your case. He handed the phone to the officer with the paper. The cop took it and pressed play. The screen lit up, showing Karen's shiny black car in the dark. Two shady guys got out, carrying big black bags. Karen waved them inside, looking sneaky. The video was short, but it was clear. The officer watched it and nodded. Good work, he said to Jake. Then he turned to Karen. This matches what we've got. You're coming with us. Karen's jaw dropped. Her clipboard fell to the grass with a soft thud. No, she yelled. That's not real. He made it up. I didn't do anything. But the other officer grabbed her arm gently and put the handcuffs on her wrists. Click, click. They locked tight, and Karen's hands were stuck together. The neighborhood gasped. People had come out of their houses when they heard the sirens. Mrs. Linda stood by her fence, her hose dripping water on the ground. Mr. Pete, the mailman, peeked from down the street, holding his mailbag. Sam, the gardener, stopped mowing a lawn to watch. Kids on bikes slowed down, their eyes big. Everyone was there, staring at Karen and the cops. What's happening? A little girl whispered to her mom. Karen's in trouble, the mom whispered back. Karen twisted and turned, trying to pull away. This is a mistake, she shouted. I'm the HOA boss. I make the rules. He's the bad guy. She glared at Jake, her face red again. But Jake just stood there, smiling a little. He didn't look like a bad guy. He looked calm, like he knew this was coming. The officers didn't listen to Karen. They started walking her to the police car, one on each side. Her fancy shoes dragged a little on the grass, and she kept yelling. You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone. That's when the big reveal happened. The officer with the paper turned to the crowd. Listen up, he said loud. This guy, he pointed at Jake, isn't just some random guy with a paintbrush. He's an undercover detective. We sent him here to sniff out trouble in Pinewood Hills. And guess what? Karen was the real trouble all along. He held up the paper again. She's been hiding stolen stuff, jewelry, money, you name it. Those guys in the video? Her partners. We've got proof. The neighborhood gasped again, even louder this time. Mrs. Linda dropped her hose, and water sprayed everywhere. A detective, she said, her mouth open. Mr. Pete laughed. I knew he was cool. Sam clapped his hands. No way. Kids whispered to each other, pointing at Jake. He's like a spy, one boy said. Jake just stood there, his grin getting bigger. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. The truth was out. Karen stopped yelling. She looked at Jake, her eyes wide and scared. A detective, she whispered. You. She couldn't believe it. All this time, she thought he was just a new guy who liked yellow paint. She thought he was easy to boss around. But he wasn't. He'd been watching her, recording her, figuring her out. She'd been so busy fighting about the fence that she didn't see the real danger. Jake. The officers opened the police car door and helped Karen inside. She sat down hard, her handcuffs clinking. This isn't fair, she said, but her voice was small now. The door shut, and the cops got in the front. The siren started again, softer this time, as the car rolled away. Karen's face pressed against the window, looking out at Jake and his yellow fence. She didn't smirk anymore. She looked mad and sad and scared all at once. Jake waved at the car as it left. Bye, Karen, he said quietly. Then he turned to the crowd. People were still staring, whispering, pointing. Mrs. Linda ran over, her floppy hat bouncing. Jake, dear. You're a detective, she asked. Jake nodded. Yup. Been working on this for a while. Mr. Pete walked up, too. That's why you asked about her car, he said. Jake grinned. Yup. You helped, Pete. Sam joined them. Man, you're awesome, he said. Jake laughed. Thanks, Sam. The kids on bikes rode closer. Are you a superhero? One girl asked. Jake bent down to her level. Nah, he said. Just a guy who likes yellow fences and catching bad guys. The girl giggled, and the crowd started clapping. They weren't mad about the fence anymore. They were happy Jake was there. Happy he'd stopped Karen. Turns out, Jake had been sent to Pinewood Hills by the police a month ago. They'd heard about stolen stuff showing up in quiet neighborhoods, and they thought someone was hiding it. Jake's job was to move in, act normal, and watch. He picked the yellow fence on purpose. It made people notice him, and it kept Karen busy. While she yelled about paint, he watched her car, her visitors, her secrets. And now, it was all over. Karen was caught, and Jake was the hero. The street got quiet again as the police car disappeared. People went back to their houses, still talking about Jake. He stayed in his yard, looking at his fence. It was still yellow, still bright, still perfect. He'd done his job, and he'd done it well. Karen thought she'd get him, but she was wrong. The real surprise? It was all on her. The police car rolled out of sight, its sirens fading into a soft whine. Karen was gone, her face still pressed against the window, staring back at Jake and his yellow fence. The street in Pinewood Hills got quiet again, but not the usual quiet. This was a buzzy, excited quiet. People stood around, looking at each other, whispering and pointing. They couldn't believe what just happened. Karen, the bossy HOA lady, was in handcuffs. And Jake? He wasn't just some guy with a paintbrush. He was a detective, a real-life hero hiding right in their neighborhood. Jake stood in his yard, hands in his pockets, looking at his fence. The yellow paint glowed in the morning sun, bright and happy, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The crowd was still there, Mrs. Linda with her floppy hat, Mr. Pete with his mailbag, Sam with his sweaty shirt, and a bunch of kids on bikes. They all stared at Jake, their mouths open, their eyes big. Nobody knew what to say at first. It was like they just watched a movie, and now the star was standing right in front of them. Mrs. Linda was the first to move. She dropped her hose, it was still spraying water all over her flowers, and ran over to Jake. Her shoe slapped the grass, and her hat almost fell off. Jake, dear, she said, her voice loud and squeaky. You're a detective. A real detective. She clapped her hands together, like she was too excited to keep them still. Jake turned to her and grinned. Yup, Mrs. Linda, he said. Been one for a while now. She grabbed his arm and shook it. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it. You're so brave. Jake laughed a little. Thanks, he said. Just doing my job. But Mrs. Linda wasn't done. She kept talking, fast and happy. All this time, I thought you were just a nice boy who liked painting. And here you were, catching bad guys. Oh, I'm so proud of you. She hugged him quick, then stepped back, fanning her face with her hand. I need to sit down, she said. This is too much for an old lady like me. She waddled back to her porch, still smiling big. Mr. Pete came next. He walked up slow, his mailbag bouncing on his shoulder. Hey, Jake, he said, scratching his head under his gray hat. That's why you asked about Karen's car, huh? Jake nodded. Yup. You helped me out, Pete. Those hints about the late-night guys? Big help. Mr. Pete's face lit up. Really? I helped a detective. He puffed out his chest a little. Wait till I tell my wife. She won't believe it. He slapped Jake on the back. You're the best, man. Keep that fence yellow, it's awesome. Then he walked off, whistling louder than usual. Sam, the gardener, jogged over after that. He'd been watching from down the street, his mower still sitting in someone's yard. Jake, he said, wiping sweat off his forehead. You're a detective? No way. Jake grinned again. Way, he said. Sam shook his head, laughing. Man, that's cool. I knew Karen was up to something weird with that car, but I didn't know you were on it. You're like a superhero or something. Jake shrugged. Not, just a guy who likes catching troublemakers. Sam clapped his hands. Well, you caught her good. Awesome job. He ran back to his mower, still laughing to himself. The kids on bikes rolled closer, their wheels squeaking. There were 5 of them, 3 boys and 2 girls, all staring at Jake like he was famous. One boy, with messy brown hair and a red shirt, spoke first. Are you a spy? He asked, his eyes huge. Jake bent down to their level. Not a spy, he said. A detective. I find bad guys and stop 'em. The girl next to him, with pigtails and a pink helmet, gasped. Like in the movies. Jake nodded. Yup, kinda like that. Another boy, with a scraped knee and a green bike, pointed at the fence. Did you paint it yellow to trick Karen? He asked. Jake winked. Maybe a little, he said. Kept her busy while I watched her. The kids all said, whoa, at the same time. The girl with pigtails giggled. You're the coolest guy ever, she said. Jake stood up and waved at them. Thanks, kids. Ride safe, okay. They nodded and pedaled off, yelling, Detective Jake. Detective Jake, as they went. The crowd started to break up after that. People went back to their houses, still talking loud. Can you believe it? One lady said to her husband. Karen's a crook, a man yelled from his porch. Jake's a hero, someone else shouted. The whole neighborhood was buzzing, like bees in a hive. Jake watched them go, still standing by his fence. He felt good. Real good. His secret was out, and it worked just like he'd planned. He thought back to how it all started. A month ago, the police chief called him into the station. Jake, the chief said, we've got a problem. Stolen stuff, jewelry, money, fancy things keeps showing up in quiet places. We think someone's hiding it in Pinewood Hills. Can you check it out? Jake said yes right away. He loved a challenge. The chief told him to move in, act normal, and watch. Don't let anyone know you're a detective, the chief said. Blend in. Jake nodded. Got it? So Jake moved to Pinewood Hills. He picked the little house with the rickety fence because it was perfect close to Karen's place, easy to watch. He painted the fence yellow on purpose. It was loud and bright, and he knew it'd get attention. He wanted Karen to focus on it. And she did. She yelled, she wrote notes, she took pictures all about the fence. It kept her busy, so she didn't notice Jake watching her car, her visitors, her secrets. It was like a game, and Jake played it smart. Now, Standing in his yard, he looked at the fence again. It wasn't just paint anymore. It was part of his trick, a trick that caught Karen. He patted the wood with his hand. "Good job, buddy," he said to the fence, like it could hear him. Then he went inside to get some water. The day was warm, and he was thirsty after all that excitement. Back at the police station, Karen wasn't happy. She sat in a little room with a table and a chair, her handcuffs off now but her hands still shaking. The officers were asking her questions. "Where'd the stolen stuff come from?" one cop asked. "Who were those guys?" said the other. Karen crossed her arms. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice grumpy. But they had proof, Jake's video, plus other stuff they'd found. They'd been watching her for weeks, just like they said. Karen didn't know it, but she was done. Outside, Pinewood Hills kept buzzing. Mrs. Linda called her friend on the phone. "You won't believe this," she said. "Karen's a thief, and Jake's a detective. Mr. Pete told every house on his mail route. Helped catch her myself," he bragged. Sam told the other gardeners. "Coolest guy I ever met," he said. The kids made up a song, "Detective Jake, he's so neat, caught bad Karen on our street." They sang it while riding their bikes, laughing and shouting. Jake sat on his porch with his water, listening to it all. He didn't need to say much. The neighborhood knew now he was the good guy. Karen thought she'd get him with her rules and her police calls, but she got herself instead. Jake's yellow fence stood tall, a big, bright winner in the sun. And Karen? She was on her way to big trouble, all because of one calm guy with a paintbrush and a secret. The police car drove away with Karen inside, its red and blue lights flashing until it turned the corner and disappeared. Pinewood Hills was quiet for a second, but then it got loud again, loud with happy voices. The neighbors stood around Jake's yard, still buzzing about what just happened. Karen, the mean HOA lady who bossed everyone around, was gone. Caught. In big trouble. And Jake? He was the hero who made it all happen. The air felt different now, like a heavy cloud had lifted and the sun was shining brighter. Karen's fancy car didn't go with her. Nope. It stayed right there in her driveway, shiny and black, but not for long. Another police car showed up, a big one with a hook on the back. It was a tow truck dressed up like a cop car. Two officers jumped out and started hooking the car up. "This is impounded," one of them said loud, so everyone could hear. "Evidence." The hook grabbed the car's front, and with a loud clank, they started pulling it away. The neighbors watched, their mouths open. Karen's pride and joy, her big, fancy ride was gone, just like that. Jake stood by his yellow fence, watching it all. He leaned against the bright wood, arms crossed, a little smile on his face. He'd known about that car for a while. He'd seen it pull up late at night with those shady guys and their big black bags. Now he knew what was in those bags: stolen stuff. Jewelry, like shiny necklaces and sparkly rings. Cash, like piles of dollar bills. Lots of it. Karen had been hiding it all in her house for months, thinking no one would catch her. But Jake did. And the police did, too. Back at the station, the cops had already opened those black bags they found at Karen's place. They dumped them out on a big table, and out came the loot: gold chains, diamond earrings, stacks of money tied with rubber bands. "She's been busy," one officer said, shaking his head. "Stealing from stores, hiding it here." Another cop wrote it all down on a clipboard, not Karen's clipboard, but one that meant real trouble for her. They had her now. No way out. Back in Pinewood Hills, the tow truck rolled away with Karen's car, and the crowd turned to Jake. He was still there, calm and cool, like nothing big had happened. But it was big. Huge. The cops had handcuffed Karen right in front of everyone. She'd screeched like a wild bird, her voice high and loud. "But what about his fence?" she'd yelled, twisting in the handcuffs. "That yellow fence. It's against the rules. Arrest him, not me." Her face was red, her hair messy, her fancy shoe slipping on the grass. The officer holding her arm just chuckled. He didn't even look mad. "Lady," he said, "a yellow fence isn't a crime." "You are." He shook his head, like it was funny she didn't get it. Karen's eyes got big, and she opened her mouth to yell again, but the other cop pushed her gently into the car. "Save it," he said, shutting the door. And that was that. Karen's last big scream about the fence didn't change a thing. She was the bad guy, not Jake. Jake watched her get hauled away, the police car kicking up a little dust as it left. He turned around slow and faced the crowd of neighbors. They were all there: Mrs. Linda with her floppy hat, Mr. Pete with his mailbag, Sam the gardener, and a bunch of kids on bikes. They looked at him different now. Not like the new guy who didn't fit in. Not like the weirdo with the yellow fence. They looked at him like he was someone special. Someone they liked. Someone they trusted. Jake scratched his head and grinned. "Guess I'll keep the yellow," he said, giving them a little wink. His voice was easy, like he was talking about the weather. But that wink? It made everyone smile. Mrs. Linda started clapping first. Her hands came together fast, clap clap clap, and her hat bounced on her head. "Oh, yes, dear," she shouted. "Keep it. It's wonderful." Then Mr. Pete joined in, clapping loud and whistling. "Yeah, Jake," he yelled. Sam clapped, too, his big hands making a booming sound. "Best fence ever," he said. The kids dropped their bikes and clapped, jumping up and down. "Yellow. Yellow," they chanted, laughing and spinning in circles. Soon, the whole crowd was cheering: moms, dads, old folks, everyone. The noise got big, filling the street with happy sounds. Jake stood there, his grin getting wider. He waved at them, just a little wave, but it made them cheer even louder. The guy they'd ignored, the guy Karen yelled at, was now their hero. Pinewood Hills would never be the same, and for once, it felt a little brighter. Mrs. Linda ran up to Jake again, her face all red from excitement. "Oh, Jake," she said. "You saved us from that awful woman. She was so mean to everyone." Jake nodded. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Linda," he said. She grabbed his hand and shook it hard. "No, no, you're a hero. A real hero. We're so lucky you moved here." She hugged him quick, then stepped back. "I'm baking you cookies tomorrow," she said. "Big ones. Chocolate chip." Jake laughed. "Can't wait," he said. Mr. Pete came over next. "Man, Jake," he said, "you tricked her good. All those questions about her car, I didn't know you were a detective." Jake shrugged. "Had to keep it quiet, Pete. You helped, though." Mr. Pete puffed up proud. "Me? Help catch a crook? Wow." He slapped Jake on the shoulder. "You're the coolest guy I know. That fence stays yellow forever, okay?" Jake nodded. "Deal," he said. Sam jogged up, still sweaty from mowing lawns. "Jake, you're amazing," he said. "I thought Karen was just bossy, but stealing? That's wild." Jake grinned. "Yup. She hit it good, but not good enough." Sam shook his head. "You got her, man. And that fence? It's the best thing here now." He gave Jake a big high five, then ran off to tell his friends. The kids came back, too. The girl with pigtails tugged Jake's sleeve. "Mr. Detective," she said, "can we paint our fence yellow, too?" Jake bent down. "Sure," he said. "Yellow's the best color." The boy with the red shirt nodded. "You're like a superhero. Do you have a cape?" Jake laughed. "No cape," he said. "Just a paintbrush." The kids giggled and ran off, yelling, "Yellow fences! Yellow fences!" The cheering died down after a while, and people started going home. But they kept smiling, kept talking. "Jake's our hero," one mom said to her son. "No more Karen rules," a dad shouted from his porch. The street felt happy, like a party had just happened. Jake stayed outside a little longer, sitting on his steps. He looked at his fence and nodded. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a sign that he'd won, and Karen had lost. At the police station, Karen wasn't smiling. She sat in a little room with gray walls, her hands on a table. The cops had taken her fancy shoes and her clipboard. She didn't look like the HOA boss now, just a grumpy lady in trouble. "I didn't do anything," she said, over and over. But the officers showed her the bags, jewelry, cash, all stolen. They showed her Jake's video, too. "That's you," one cop said, pointing at the screen. With those guys. Hiding stuff. Karen shook her head. No. It's a trick, she yelled. But they didn't listen. They had proof, and she was stuck. The police chief came in later. He was a big man with a loud voice. Karen Wilson, he said, you're going to jail for a long time. Stealing's a big crime. Karen slumped in her chair. But my neighborhood, she whispered. The chief shook his head. Not yours anymore, he said. Thanks to Jake, it's safe now. He walked out, and Karen just sat there, quiet and mad. Back in Pinewood Hills, the day went on. The sun got higher, and the yellow fence stayed bright. Jake went inside to rest, but the neighbors kept talking. Mrs. Linda baked those cookies she promised, big, gooey ones with chocolate chips. She brought them to Jake's door that afternoon. For our hero, she said, handing him a plate. Jake took them and smiled. Thanks, Mrs. Linda. You're the best. She waved and went home, humming a happy tune. Mr. Pete told everyone on his mail route. I helped Jake catch her, he said at every house. People clapped for him, too. Sam painted a little yellow stripe on his mower, just for fun. For Jake, he said, showing it off. The kids drew pictures of Jake and his fence with crayons yellow everywhere. They taped them to their windows so everyone could see. By night, Pinewood Hills was calm again. Jake sat on his porch, eating a cookie, looking at the stars. The fence glowed a little in the moonlight, still standing tall. Karen was gone. Her rules were gone. Her mean voice was gone. The neighborhood felt free, like it could breathe again. Jake finished his cookie and went inside. He'd done his job. Justice was served, and it felt good. The next day, the HOA had a meeting. No Karen this time. Mr. Thompson, the vice president, stood up. Karen's out, he said. She broke the law. We don't need her rules anymore. The neighbors cheered. And Jake, someone asked. Mr. Thompson smiled. He's welcome here. Yellow fence and all. More cheers. Pinewood Hills was brighter now inside and out. The police car rolled away with Karen inside, its lights flashing red and blue until it was gone. The street in Pinewood Hills got quiet for a moment, like everyone was holding their breath. Then it burst into noise, happy noise. Neighbors stood around Jake's yard, talking fast, smiling big, pointing at where the car had been. Karen, the mean lady who made all the rules, was caught. She wasn't the boss anymore. And Jake? He was the one who made it happen. The air felt light and fun, like a big storm had passed and left sunshine behind. Karen's fancy car didn't go with her. Oh no. It stayed parked in her driveway, all shiny and black, looking proud. But not for long. Another car came, a big one with police lights and a hook on the back. It was a tow truck, ready to take her car away. Two officers hopped out, wearing their blue uniforms. One had a clipboard, and the other carried a big chain. This car's impounded, the officer with the clipboard said, loud so everyone could hear. It's part of the crime now. The other officer hooked the chain to the car's front. Clank. The sound was loud, and the car started moving, pulled up onto the truck. Neighbors peeked out their windows and doors, watching it all. Mrs. Linda stood by her fence, her floppy hat on crooked. Mr. Pete, the mailman, stopped walking his route to stare. Sam, the gardener, leaned on his mower down the street. Kids on bikes rolled closer, their eyes big. Where's it going? One boy asked. To the police, his mom whispered back. The tow truck's engine roared, and Karen's fancy car rolled away, off to the police station. It was gone just like Karen. Jake watched from his yard, standing by his yellow fence. He had his hands in his pockets, and a little smile on his face. He'd known about that car. He'd seen it pull up at night with those shady guys and their big black bags. Now he knew what was in those bags: stolen stuff. Shiny jewelry, like necklaces and bracelets with sparkly stones. Piles of cash, like dollar bills all rolled up. Karen had been hiding it all in her house for months, thinking she was too smart to get caught. But Jake caught her. And the police caught her, too. At the police station, the cops were busy. They'd taken those black bags from Karen's house and dumped them out on a big table. Out came the goodies: gold rings, silver chains, earrings that twinkled under the lights. There was money, too, lots of it. Stacks and stacks of bills, some crumpled, some neat. "Look at this," one officer said, holding up a necklace. "She's been stealing for a long time." Another cop nodded. "Yup. Hiding it right here in Pinewood Hills." They wrote it all down, making a list of every shiny thing and every dollar. Karen was in big trouble now. Back in the neighborhood, Jake remembered how it all went down. The cops had handcuffed Karen right there in his yard. She didn't go quietly, oh no. She screeched like a cat stuck in a tree. "But what about his fence?" she yelled, her voice high and loud. She twisted her arms, trying to pull away, her fancy shoe slipping on the grass. "That yellow fence. It's wrong. It's against the rules. Arrest him, not me." Her hair was messy, her face red, her eyes wild. The officer holding her just chuckled. He didn't yell back or get mad. He just looked at her like she was silly. "Lady," he said, "a yellow fence isn't a crime. You are." His voice was calm, and he even smiled a little. Karen's mouth opened wide, like she couldn't believe it. "What?" she shouted. "That's not fair." But the other officer didn't care. He opened the police car door and said, "Get in." Karen kept yelling, but they pushed her inside gentle-like. The door shut with a thump, and her screeches got muffled. Then the car drove off, and that was the end of Karen's big fight. Jake watched it all happen, standing by his fence. He saw the car leave, kicking up dust on the road. He didn't say much, just watched with that little smile. Then he turned around slow and looked at the crowd of neighbors. They were all there, staring at him. Mrs. Linda with her big hat. Mr. Pete with his mailbag. Sam with his sweaty shirt. The kids with their bikes. Even some moms and dads who usually stayed inside. They didn't look at him like a stranger anymore. They looked at him like he was special, like he was their friend. Jake scratched his head and grinned bigger. "Guess I'll keep the yellow," he said, giving them a quick wink. His voice was easy, like he was talking about what he'd eat for lunch. But that wink, it made everyone happy. Mrs. Linda started clapping right away. Her hands went clap clap clap, fast and loud. "Oh, yes, Jake," she shouted. "Keep it yellow. It's perfect." Her hat bounced, and she smiled so big her eyes crinkled up. Mr. Pete clapped next. His hands were big, and the sound was loud. "Yeah, Jake," he yelled. "Best fence ever." He whistled, to a sharp, happy sound. Sam joined in, clapping with his strong gardener hands. "Boom boom boom. Yellow's the coolest," he said. The kids dropped their bikes and clapped, too, jumping up and down. "Yellow. Yellow," they cheered, giggling and spinning around. Then the moms and dads clapped, and the old folks, too. Soon, the whole crowd was cheering loud and happy, like a big party. Jake stood there, his grin growing. He waved at them, just a little wave with his hand. That made them cheer even more. "Yay, Jake," someone shouted. "You're awesome," yelled someone else. The noise filled the street, bouncing off the houses. The guy they'd ignored, the guy Karen picked on, was now their hero. Pinewood Hills felt different now. Not dark and bossy like when Karen was around. It felt bright and fun, like Jake's fence. Mrs. Linda ran up to Jake first. She was so excited she almost tripped. "Jake, dear," she said, grabbing his arm. "You got rid of that mean Karen. She was awful to everyone." Her voice was high and fast. Jake nodded. "Just doing my job," he said, calm as always. Mrs. Linda shook her head. No, you're a hero. A big hero. We're so happy you're here." She hugged him quick, then stepped back. "I'm making you cookies," she said. "Big ones. Tomorrow." Jake smiled. "Thanks, Mrs. Linda. I like cookies." Mr. Pete walked up next, his mailbag swinging. "Jake, man," he said, "you tricked her good. I didn't know you were so smart." Jake shrugged. "Had to keep it secret, Pete. You helped, though." Mr. Pete's eyes got big. "Me? Helped a detective?" He stood taller. "That's so cool. I'm telling everyone." He slapped Jake's shoulder. Keep that fence yellow, okay? It's the best. Jake nodded. You got it, he said. Sam came over, still sweaty from work. Jake, he said, his voice loud. You're the best. Karen was a thief? Wow. Jake grinned. Yup. She hid it good, but not from me. Sam laughed. You got her. And that fence? It's awesome now. He gave Jake a high five, his hand making a loud smack. Then he ran off to tell his buddies. The kids on bikes rolled up again. The girl with pigtails pulled on Jake's shirt. Mr. Jake, she said, can we have a yellow fence, too? Jake bent down. Sure, he said. Yellow's fun. The boy with the red shirt nodded. You're like a superhero. Do you fight bad guys all the time? Jake laughed. Sometimes, he said. But I like painting, too. The kids cheered and rode off, yelling, yellow rules. The crowd started going home after that, but they kept smiling. Jake's our hero, a mom said to her kid. No more mean Karen, a dad shouted. The street felt alive like everyone was friends now. Jake stayed outside a bit, sitting on his steps. He looked at his fence and nodded. It wasn't just paint. It was his trick to catch Karen. And it worked. At the police station, Karen wasn't happy. She sat in a small room with no windows, her hands on a table. The cops had taken her fancy stuff, her shoes, her purse, everything. She didn't look big and bossy now. She looked small and grumpy. I didn't do it, she said, loud and whiny. But the cops showed her the bags, jewelry, money, all stolen. They played Jake's video, too. That's you, one said, pointing. With the bad guys. Karen shook her head. No. It's fake, she yelled. But they had her. The police chief came in. He was tall and serious. Karen Wilson, he said, you're going to jail. Stealing's bad. Karen slumped down. But my rules, she mumbled. The chief shook his head. No more rules. Jake fixed it. He left, and Karen sat there, mad and quiet. Back home, Pinewood Hills kept going. Mrs. Linda baked cookies, big, yummy ones, and gave them to Jake. For our hero, she said. Jake took them and smiled. Thanks, he said. Mr. Pete told his whole route. I helped Jake, he bragged. Sam painted his mower yellow. For Jake, he said. The kids drew pictures, yellow fences everywhere. That night, Jake sat outside, eating a cookie. The stars were out, and his fence glowed a little. Karen was gone. Her mean ways were gone. Pinewood Hills was happy and brighter because of him.